Well, Happy New Year, everybody. It's been a year since we've seen each other. Oh, Lord. They say that absence makes the heart grow fonder. I think it's really true. I know it's only been a couple of weeks since we've actually been together. But I know I missed you. I know Sonia and we missed you. And we're happy to be back together today, whether you're here in person or for all of you that are joining us online. We just want to say welcome to VERVE Community. Welcome to 2021. As Sonia said, I think for some of us, we're just glad to be rid of last year, right? And excited about what God wants to do in our lives this year. And so what we're going to do, we're going to kick off with a brand new series. And every January, I do my best to try to just hear from God about what he wants to say to us to start a brand new year. So we're starting a series today called Reach. And I want to challenge you in this series. I know we're coming out of a very difficult year. And as I was thinking about the new year, in some ways, I kind of felt like the only thing that changed was the calendar. Like there's so many things that still remain the same, even about this new year. It doesn't feel like a whole lot is changing. And yet we're entering into a new year. And I'm saying that because I think for some of us, we've probably been a little bit hesitant about reaching for something new this year. I don't know how many of you set out to do New Year's resolutions every year. My guess is a lot less people this year that even do that have probably sat down and journaled or wrote out some of the things that they want to reach for this year. And I just think in this type of environment that we're in right now, that would be the natural thing to do, is just kind of wait and see what happens. But I want to challenge you over the next 5 weeks to reach farther, to reach higher, to reach deeper. This is what we're going to talk about for the next few weeks. Today we're going to launch and kick off with this idea of reaching further. I know coming out of a tough year, you're hesitant on, how realistic you can be with your vision and your goals this year. But I want to look past all that and challenge us today individually, as a church, corporately, to reach a little bit further. Maybe further than you've ever, to really stretch out and reach a little bit further. Now, here's what I know about the ability to reach further is there's some things you've got to do in order to be able to expand or extend your reach. Some of you know, a few years ago joined CrossFit. That became I just fell in love with this type of exercise, of trying to build myself stronger, to build my durability, to build my muscles. I know it doesn't look like it today, but give me a break. We just came out of Christmas season, okay? We haven't done any working out for a couple of weeks, but Sonia and I decided we'd jump in and try a workout yesterday morning after 2 weeks off. And today we woke up, we're like sore, we could barely move. Like you find out that you're sore in places you didn't even know existed in your body. We did like this full body workout yesterday with weights, guys, not with the weight. We're not with weights, guys. Anyways, some of you, anyways. And what I realized was my body was really tight. And what I know from doing CrossFit the last few years, that in order for you to reach further, to grow stronger, is you've got to stretch. And so yesterday morning, right, we woke up, it was early, it was really cold out. When you get out of bed, like you can barely move. Well, those of you that are over 40 years old, it takes a while to like get going. And so I spent about the first 20 minutes yesterday doing nothing but just stretching out my muscles. And so CrossFit has this program, it's called ROMWOD, Range of Motion Workout of the Day. And literally what they tell you is before you ever attempt any workouts of the day, that you first need to go through your ROMWOD. It's about 20 to 30 minutes of just stretching. And if you kind of know what muscle groups you'll be working out that day, you target your stretching to those specific muscle groups. Because in order for you to grow stronger, you've got to first stretch those muscles. And so this is important. This is also will prohibit you from getting injured. This is one of the things about ROMWOD, about stretching, is it literally stretching your muscles so that you don't injure yourself. If you let's just say your hamstrings, for example, right? If they're not stretched equally and you're doing deadlifts, let's say, right? And you're just really stretching those hamstrings. If one of them isn't stretched properly and the other one, it starts to compensate. You start to compensate with your back. So if you ever done deadlifts and you get done and your back sore, you probably hadn't stretched enough to start the workout. And so other parts of your body, they're compensating for that particular muscle that maybe is being overexerted because you hadn't stretched. Here's the other thing about stretching is it's not just to reduce injury, it also is to increase your capacity. Your muscles cannot reach their fullest potential if they have not been stretched. I was thinking about that in terms of not just our physical strength, but spiritually. I want you to think about your capacity this year, the potential, the plans, the promises. They were saying about the promises of God that God has in store for this year, the extent that God wants you to reach in your life, to reach further than you've ever reached before. That you've got to first stretch so that your spiritual muscles can reach their full capacity. I don't know about you, but I feel like 2020 was definitely a year of stretching. Come on, somebody. We were stretched. I remember as a church, when the pandemic first hit, and to be honest with you, we didn't know what to do. We had never done anything online. All you that are enjoying our online presence this morning, and most of us that are here, that we did that for about 6 or 7 months. We didn't have any of that in place, and God just began to stretch us. Stretched us. And so the way I like to look back at 2020 is not as a disappointment or as a discouragement. I think God was using that for me, for us as a church. I thought he said, this is a good time for us to do some stretching. Because ultimately, I want you to reach further. I know what God wants. This is why we're planning a campus in Pomona. Is I know that God wants us to reach further. He wants us to expand our influence in the area. He wants us to reach more people. And so spiritually, even individually, listen to me this morning, because sometimes you can get upset about a season where it doesn't feel like you're growing, it doesn't feel like you're building, it doesn't feel like you're advancing. And I want to encourage you not to discard those seasons of your life that God's actually stretching you so that you can reach your full capacity. And so that's what stretching. That's why they say you do these ROMWAD exercises for 20 or 30 minutes before you ever even enter into a particular workout. And so the second thing it does is it increases your capacity. Here's what as I was thinking about stretching, I was thinking stretching is actually natural. It's natural. You think about babies, right? In that belly of their mother. A lot of times they're kicking, they're stretching. I remember Megan and Drew, the first time they would start stretching at certain parts of the day and they're kicking up against Sonia's stomach. We were feeling it was so, it's natural. It's what we naturally do. You ever wake up in the morning, you're yawning, and you just kind of wake up, and he's like, You want to do that right now? Because actually, did you know that stretching actually like releases endorphins in your mind? You feel better. Some of you just need to stretch today. Go ahead. Just stretch it out right now. Like 7th inning stretch right now at VERVE Community. That doesn't mean I'm almost done, by the way. I'm just getting started. Some of you are like, oh, thank God, we're getting out early today. No, I just don't want you to fall asleep on me, so I want you to release some. But I mean, it actually feels good. These endorphins are really, it's natural for us to stretch. But I wonder then why spiritually so many of us are reluctant to stretch. We're so hesitant to allow God. This ought to be the natural reaction. We ought to be coming into 2021, and wherever you're at spiritually in your life, you ought to be saying, I want to be reaching for new things in God, new levels, new heights, new things I've never experienced. I want to stretch myself. I want to see what God can do through me. I want to see how God's going to build my faith this year. This ought to be our natural reaction spiritually to stretching. But I think one of the reasons, if you think about it physically, have you ever watched people stretch? It's funny. You ever seen people? Like, I don't even want to do it today because I'm wearing jeans and we might have a few mishaps today. Wardrobe malfunctions if I did it. But some people look stupid when they're stretching, right? It's funny. Like, you ever see they're bent over, they're in all these weird positions, they're stretching these weird parts of their body. And I think sometimes when it comes to God stretching us spiritually, we think people think this looks kind of crazy. Like, why would you attempt to do that? Why would you step out in faith? Why? Let's think about that song earlier when God's calling us out from the shore. And he's calling us into deeper water. And sometimes it can look, you can have people like, what are you thinking? Like, what are you thinking attempting to do that? What do you think there's no way you've been called or qualified to do that in your life. You don't have all the resources. You don't have all the talent. You don't have all the abilities you need to be able to attempt that, to start a new business, to start a new prayer group, to start a small group, to start a Bible study group on your, like, who do you think you are? And you're just stretching. And I think sometimes we start hearing the voice of people and it causes us to retreat. Here's the thing, if you don't stretch, it can be actually very detrimental to your body. And people develop diseases from not stretching, from not reaching out. And it can cause difficult things physically to your body. There's stiffness, there's dysfunction, there's deterioration of your joints. And over time, it can even lead to arthritis if you're not stretching. Can I tell you, if you're not stretching spiritually, that you either grow or you die. You die. And I think so many of us, we get lethargic in our relationship with God, in our work for the kingdom, and what God's trying to do, and the faith that God's trying to stretch in our life. And for some of us, we've just conditioned ourselves to just sit back. You know why stretching is so important physically? Because most of your time during the day, you spend sitting down. You're sitting down driving, you're sitting down at your desk, you're sitting on the couch. Even if you are standing, a lot of times you're slouched over, you got bad posture. Think about this spiritually. How much of our time is just spent sitting around? Not active in our relationship with God, not active in what God's called us to do, not actively using the gifts that God's placed inside of us. I think for many of us, we've just become lethargic in our relationship with God. And meanwhile, and this is what I want to challenge you to do over the next couple weeks. I want to challenge you as we can come into this out of the gate in this new year to stretch, to make a decision with me for the next couple weeks that this year I'm going to allow God to stretch me, that I want to reach a little bit further. Individually, I'm asking you to start thinking about how God's wanting you to reach, expand your reach for new things that God, as a church collectively, how God's calling us this year to reach a little bit further, And so I want to take you to a story. It's a very famous story. It's actually in the life of the Apostle Peter. They kind of sang it about it actually this morning. It's in Matthew chapter 14, verse 23. Watch this. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land. So Jesus had decided at this point, he's been busy. Everybody's craving his attention. He's physically tired. And so he sets off and he goes to find a place to rest. Meanwhile, the disciples jump in a boat and they go off to find Jesus a little bit later. And so they're far away from land because the strong wind had arisen and they were fighting heavy waves. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. Can you imagine that? This was like, oh my God, this is like a dream, or maybe I should say a nightmare coming. Jesus is walking on the water in the middle of the night towards them. And so when they see them, their natural reaction, like probably all of us, was that they were terrified. And in their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost. It's a ghost." And as I was reading this week, I thought about storms in life have a way of causing us to react like this. This is what happens in the storms of life. Jesus, and I don't know about you, a lot of times Jesus, when he comes and he's calling me to step out a little further, sometimes it's right in the middle of a storm in my life when God calls me to take a step of faith. And the disciples, because this is what storms do, storms in our life have a way of causing us to retreat instead of reach. And they immediately find themselves, they're retreating, they're terrified, they're scared. And they're crying out, it's a ghost. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." I think the first thing that we can learn from Peter's story is that in order to reach further, we have to first take courage. Take courage. Think about it. Think about this year. Think about everything that we've been through over the last year. So many of us today could be filled with fear and uncertainty about the future. Right? Just think about it. It's like it's a storm. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and here comes Jesus walking out on the water saying, "Don't worry, Everything's going to be okay. They're freaking out, but Jesus tell them, you've got to take courage. So you have an option when it comes to facing the storms of life. You can either react with a spirit of fear, of cowardice, or you can choose in the middle of storms to take courage. I was sharing this sermon with Sonia earlier this week, and she said, it reminds me of when we were a kid and an earthquake would happen. And she said, me and Nikki, we would be freaking out. We'd come running out of the room scared, duck and cover. She said, and my dad would be walking around the room like, oh, this isn't nothing to fear. This is fun. I don't know how many people you know that do that. In the middle of an earthquake, I ain't lying. I'm like looking for the door frame. That's what they taught me. Stand in the door frame. But here's Roy. So he's walking around, and he's just like, no, this is fun, guys. This is great. Don't you love it? But seriously, think about our attitudes, how we react to the storms of life. We can either cower in the face of the storm, or we can take courage. And I'm going to tell you, in order for you to reach further, to stretch out a little bit further, and to reach out to what God's calling you, you're going to have to take courage. And I realize this is not always our natural response. We've heard the term a lot this year, shelter in place, right? During the whole pandemic. In fact, it was some of the first things they told us when this disease was just wreaking havoc in our world, was everybody needs to shelter in place. And I think that's a natural response to danger, to storm, right? I think rightfully so. In fact, I think that was probably the right approach to even specifically with the COVID pandemic. But I think that's our natural response is shelter in place. Our natural reaction, right, is this need for survival. What does it take to survive the storm? And oftentimes that's like shelter in place. That's everybody bunker down, right? And just let's get through the storm. But I'm here to tell you today that that's not the spirit, the attitude that God wants when it comes to the spiritual storms in your life. He's not calling you just to hunker down. Jesus is saying, don't be afraid. Don't be terrified. I come to tell somebody this morning that's overwhelmed with fear and anxiety about everything that's happening in your life and the future and what 2021 holds. Jesus said, don't be terrified. Don't be afraid. It is I. Take courage. Take courage. This is what I've come to tell somebody today. In order for you to reach a little bit further, you've got to take courage. Maybe you've been scared of the opinions of other people, so you're not reaching for more. Can I tell you, you'll never experience more unless you reach for it. You'll never reach for it until you choose courage over fear. Maybe you've been hesitant to set any new goals, any New Year's resolutions this year. Maybe you've been stripped of your ambition and your ability to dream. Maybe it's been disappointment or heartbreak or different situations that have caused us to recoil in our life spiritually. I want you to notice this. Jesus never even came onto the boat. That's what you think Jesus would have done. The storm, they're scared, we might drown. You would assume Jesus in his loving, compassionate way would have stepped onto the boat and just caused the storm to calm. Jesus didn't. He doesn't step out on the boat, into the boat. He doesn't calm the storm. In fact, Jesus does the complete opposite. Jesus calls Peter to step out. If you want to reach further, you've got to take courage. Write this down. You got to take courage. And the second thing you do is you need to take a step. See, some of us, when the storms hit, we're wanting Jesus to come in and just calm everything, make the storms go away. But Jesus said, there's times Jesus says it, but there's other times that Jesus says, no, I'm not going to calm the storm. In fact, I'm going to call you to take a step. I'm going to call you to step out. This is how it's been for me personally. At the times God's called me to step out, I've been in the midst of some of the most difficult times of my life. When I was wanting God just to bring peace, to calm the storms of my life, but it was like God's calling me to a place of courage that I've never reached that far before. And instead, Jesus says, come on out. Go ahead, step out on those massive waves. I want you to step out. Watch this. Watch this. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. And he says, come. Peter gets out of the boat and he walks on the water towards Jesus. And that's what you have to do in your life. This is what it means to reach further. Life might have taught you that the safest thing to do is to hide, to keep your head down, to not take any risks. But Jesus is saying, come on, step away from the shore. Step into the deep waters. I know the sea is troubling. I know life feels like it's overwhelming you, but I'm calling you to step out. Let me ask you this morning, where is God calling you to take a step in your life of faith today? Come on, somebody. I know this may be a difficult season. It's full of fear and worry and anxiety. And in the midst of that, this week, maybe you've been hearing the voice of God and he's been calling you to reach a little further. He's been calling you to step out. You've been hesitate. Your natural reaction is to shelter in place, to cover up, bury the hatch, everybody bunker down. And Jesus is saying, no, I want you to step out of the boat. I want you to get some courage and I want you to step out of the boat. He's not saying ignore the realities of the waves, but he's saying to put your trust in a reality that's greater than the storms of your life. He says, come on, somebody. What is it you've been feeling already at the beginning of this year that God's calling you to say, step out, take a step. You know what I'm talking about because God's been speaking to you already. And I know the voice of fear is trying to overwhelm you. It's trying to speak louder than God's voice in your life. But today, Jesus is saying, I want you to step out. I want you to step out. Come out of your fear. Grab some courage and take a step. Sonia was telling me that there's a certain therapeutic skill, and it's called the turning of the mind. And they use this when helping people deal with horrific things that have happened in their life as they teach them to turn their mind. And so instead of avoiding the reality of what's happened, they teach them to turn their mind and not always be looking back to the hurt and the pain. We deal with that in what's called acceptance. And so instead of avoiding that, we turn and we accept that those things happen. I was thinking about that spiritually for some of us. Because watch what Peter, he steps out on the water. He takes a few steps and the scriptures tell us, but then he begins to look around. And Jesus hadn't calmed the waves. There's still massive waves beating all around Peter. I was thinking, what if some of us could use this therapeutic skill spiritually as we step out to do what God calls us to do? That there may be moments that we step out and we fail because we've turned our mind to the wrong things. And we're focused on the storms, we're focused on the waves, and we're focused on all the reasons why we can't accomplish what God called us to do. And we're focused on the lack of resources. Think about us planning this church in Pomona this last year. We made the decision in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a storm. It still hasn't subsided, but we just made a decision because God, I'm telling you, it's just what God, this is the way he works with me. It's like it's always in the most unopportune times when God calls me to step out. And it's easy. This last part of this last year, I ain't gonna lie, there's been moments where I'm like, but God, I'm not sure if we have the resources, the people, we're gonna have the right team. We haven't even found a venue yet, and it's easy, and you gotta turn your mind. This is a process, it's ongoing process. It's not just one time and then, everything's gonna be great. No, there'll still be the voices of doubt, even the voices of reason that try to sway you and try to get you distracted. I'm telling you today to turn your mind back towards Jesus. Listen, Peter wasn't stepping out on those waves. That's not really what Peter was stepping out on. He was stepping out in a promise and faith on the one that ultimately could control the way. He was stepping out on the most sure ground that was possible that day. Jesus had told him to come. As you take steps this year to reach a little bit further in your life as a church, collectively, as we take steps this year to reach a little further. Listen, we're not just stepping out on a whim. We're not stepping out on our own ability to sustain what God's calling us to do. We're stepping out on the call of God on our life. So again, I want to ask you, what is God calling you to do this year? How's God calling you to reach a little bit further? I'm challenging you to take a step. This is Jesus' response to the storm. All right, Peter, here's what I want you to do. Come on out. Come on out. Some of you, listen, it's going to seem like a ghost when God begins to put his call on your life for what he wants to do. It's going to be scary. You're going to be terrified. I'm already thinking about what God's called us to do at church. I ain't gonna lie. There are moments when it's terrifying. It's scary. It's like, are we really going to be able to accomplish, God, everything that you're calling us to do? But I'm challenging you. This is God's calling on your life. Take courage and then just take a step. And then take another step. And when the enemy tries to distract you and people think you look funny and people think you're crazy and people don't, there's no way that God can do it. Just turn. It's the turning of the mind. Just the turning of my spirit. So I want you to just turn back and say, but God, you said come. Call me out. And this is what we're doing as a church. This is what we're doing individually. And watch this. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. He began to sink. He cried out, Lord, save me. And watch this. Watch this. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand. He caught him. This is what I'm telling you this morning. I'm calling you to reach out. The Holy Spirit today is already speaking to you to reach out. But can I tell you, it's not just you extending the reach. It's not just you stepping out to what God's called you to do. But in those moments that you doubt, because it'll happen, in those moments that you begin to sink, I want you to know you're not going to drown. Jesus reached out and said, I got you, Peter. It's all good. And he caught him. Because God doesn't leave us hanging. He doesn't leave us to reach out on our own. I'm telling you, you're stepping out on the most sure ground as possible. The third thing I want to say to you today is not only take courage, not only take a step, but I want to challenge you today to stretch out. To stretch out. Think about this. Peter is the only one that I know of, other than Jesus, to have ever walked on water. You talk about a stretch. Peter was being called to ask to do something that had never been done and has never been done since. Something that was impossible. And I'm wondering, in what ways is God trying to stretch you out today? In what ways is God calling you to do something that was uniquely his call in your life to do that maybe no one else has ever done? Maybe it's never been accomplished, but God's birthing inside of you a call on your life to step out into. I'm telling you, I'm challenging you today to stretch out. I'm here to tell you that the only way you'll reach your full capacity, your full potential, and what God's called you to do is if you're willing to be stretched, to stretch out to what God's calling you to do. A few years ago, our family, this is back when you could travel internationally. Remember those days? and we had made a commitment about 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was, that every year we're going to try to take a trip out of the country. The kids were getting older and we wanted to just, let them experience different cultures, see the world. And so we decided the kids were old enough now, we could do that. And we went to Italy. Amazing trip. And we were in Venice and they told us, this wasn't even part of our trip, but we were there checking in. And the lady said, have you ever been to one of the Venetian glass manufacturers? I didn't really know anything about it. So all the famous glass that you see throughout the world, most of it is actually Venetian glass. She said, you got to go over there. And they take you over in this little boat over this small little island where the most famous Venetian glass manufacturing is. And so we go over there and they're taking you through the tour. And at first, you ever seen like the little glass figurines that they sell, right? And so they're taking us through the tour and they said, now we're going to let you see how these unique pieces of glass are actually formed. And so they said, we're going to walk through and you're going to actually see, they're called the master glass blowers. These are like the artists. They're artists with what they can do with glass. And so we walk into this room and there's this massive furnace. And here's one of these massive glass blowers, and he's got this long rod, and on the end of it is glass. And so they would take that, and they put it into the furnace, and they heat it. They heat it to about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And they've got it in that furnace, and I didn't know this up until this point. But glass, when it's heated to that point, it actually becomes very formidable. In fact, I watched, he pulled that piece of glass out of the furnace, and he took these small little tongs, like think of tongs that, you're flipping bacon with in the morning. I know everything has to be food related with me, right? But think about it. And he takes these little tongs. Here's this glass at 2,000 degrees. And all of a sudden this glass becomes, it's easily stretched. In fact, they would take those tongs, this blob of glass, And he would just begin to pick it, and that glass would it was like stringy, and it would stretch. And these master glass blowers, they're so artistic and so talented that just with those tongs, and he was done, he lets it sit for like 30 seconds, and here he handed me this beautiful little glass figurine. And I was thinking about that in relation to our lives. I was thinking sometimes we don't want the storms in life. We don't want the pressure. We'd rather just be comfort, live inside of our comfort zones. But sometimes God allows the heat, the pressure of this life. He's got to sit in that furnace because ultimately he wants to stretch us to reach our full capacity. Sometimes it's those fiery moments in our life that are actually our deal for God to be able to stretch us into what he ultimately was trying to create with us. And so that day when I walked out, I burnt my first and only piece of art that I've ever had. And this sits in our house today. And they had it up in this window, and the waves are coming up against the window there of the manufacturing facility. And I got to watch. They take just a big old blob of glass. And it's heavy. But I bought this. Only piece of art I've ever owned because it's so amazing. I wanted this to be a reminder to me. Sometimes in the storms of life, sometimes amidst the pressure and the heat, when I want to bail out, when I want to shelter in, when I want to shelter in place, when I want to cower down and not allow God, sometimes it's those moments that I'm most pliable, that God just with his tongue can say, okay, I'm going to stretch you a little bit. And I'm going to form you into everything I created you to be. So I want to challenge somebody today to stretch out. To stretch out. To stretch out. What is it that God's called you to do this year? And maybe you've been hesitant. Maybe you've been fearful and you haven't wanted to take act. What is it that God's called you to give, but you're afraid because you think that you're inadequate? What is it that God's called you to sacrifice financially, but you're saying, but I can't afford to do that, Pastor Donnie? I want you to tell God today that you believe that he can stretch you into what you need to be. That God can stretch you. That you're okay with God taking you further than what you're comfortable with. That you're okay with God stretching you further than you can naturally go. That you're okay with God stretching you further than your resources will sustain you, further than your natural giftings will take you, further than the expectations of others for you. Is there anybody here this morning that would agree with me today? God, I'm willing to be stretched. Go ahead. I believe, God, that you can stretch me, that you can take me to whatever you need for me to do. Why don't you stand with me this morning? I'm challenging you today. When Jesus says come, when he calls you out, you were expecting God to just calm all the storm. We thought 2021, the pandemic's going to go away. Everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be calmed down. Some of you have had some storms in your life. I'm not talking about COVID. I'm just talking about storms in your life. And you've been praying and you were expecting God just to calm the sea and make everything okay and all your problems disappear. That's not what Jesus had planned. Jesus is saying, step out. Step out of the boat. Step out of the boat.